Fetishization of democracy. If we think democracy is the kind of abstract ideal and that it is open to all premises, for instance, open to all worldviews, then we have started to fetishize democracy. And that to me begins to erase the oligarchic condition that I tried to argue a second ago. In other words, the fetishization of democracy emerges when we think that democracy is identical to the horizontality, that it does somehow or another warrant verticality. So my argument is that it always warrants verticality. So deterritorialization versus territorialization. When we territorialize democracy, then the ruling premises are in charge. And not all premises can coexist. Every inclusion is someone else's exclusion. Every intervention is someone else's harm. And at that moment, then, democracy is no longer, democracy cannot simply sit out there in the abstract. It must be territorialized into real-world conditions. And rather often, those real-world conditions are determined by the nation-state itself. And so then democracy bends to the will of economic growth, for instance, in the name of releasing potentiality. Or it bends to the will, or it allows for the privileging of the citizen and the not privileging of the non-citizen. Because the nation-state says that it must do that. It must privilege the citizen. And in this particular case, then Trump, in that way, in privileging the citizen, was working within a territorialized version of democracy. It's not as if it was all that outlandish, that we owe to the citizen the first set of resources before we do anything about non-citizens. These become the contradictions which I think are unresolvable, and we don't know how to finally deal with them. Almost all of my work is on behalf of the non-citizens, for the undocumented. I've written a lot about that. But I've also interviewed all of those folks who are resisting the undocumented, who in fact are resisting immigrants. And I think I've come to understand their worldview. And I think I've come to understand where they're coming from. And I think I've come to understand how they frame themselves as being ultra-democrats. In other words, that they are preserving democracy in their view, or they're preserving the nation state. And it's not as if these arguments are ridiculous in their minds. They make their own kind of argument. It works within a specific kind of set of premises. It's not the set of premises that I accept, but we talk to each other anyway. So, I think, again, the fetishization of democracy, the problems of territorialization, deterritorialization, are all part of the problem. Now, this is interesting. This comes from a professor of American Studies of George Washington. And I'll just read a few things. The ugly freedoms in American politics today increasingly justify minority rule, prejudice, and anti-democratic governance. If we don't push back against their growing popularity, we'll have ceded what freedom means to those who support monopolistic rule and further the country's downward slide toward authoritarianism. And this is a standard set of arguments. I certainly, in one sense, I certainly agree with her. But here's a problem. This comes from Ann Phillips, Unconditional Equality. I really highly recommend it. It's really quite a good book. And I think if you read Unconditional Equality, you come up with the sense that Anchor is also working with particular kinds of premises. So here's a premise that she's making, Anchor the other person. Can we cleanse the body politic of false premises? Can we ever do that? Are those who hold false premises marked as unworthy? And so here is Ann Phillips's argument. Those who are most alert to the failings of right-wing nationalisms and populisms fall into a kind of anti-democracy that points to differences in knowledge or experience or intelligence as relevant considerations in assessing who is entitled to a political voice. Equality is not conditional on any of these and is not something to be withdrawn if people fail to meet the conditions. So, does the left thesis require moral outrage and a demeaning of the right when we critique the January 6 protesters, for instance? And if that is true, then where is the unconditional equality that we might want to grant to everyone? And if we do not grant unconditional equality to something like QAnon, if QAnon is unworthy, in other words, have we stumbled into a kind of anti-democracy? Is this the arrogance of the left? So where is the attack on democracy? Is the attack on democracy coming from the right against, say, the Capitol building, against democracy? Or is the anti-democracy coming from the left in a kind of a curious way, if we're going to demean the right in ways that do not grant a kind of unconditional equality? These are tough questions.